I'm going to start out today's lecture by asking some questions about an example of Scarpa's work that is not entirely similar to the exercise that we did during the Barragan lecture, but similar. So I'll ask you to get a piece of paper and a pencil ready, just so that you can jot down some responses. So I'll give you a second to go do that. And when you look at this image, I'd like you to write down a few things, bullet points, about what you see here that is traditional. Okay, in a second set of bullet points, I'd like you to jot down what you see here that is modern. Okay, so let's go through that for a second. As far as the tradition goes, you may have noted some details that you see here. Over on the left of the image, you may have noted the pilaster. You may have noticed the cornice that runs horizontally across the image, a little bit higher up than halfway. You might have noted some of the detailing that surrounds the squarish recession to the left, or the half circular recession over to the right. All of those are things that we can see in traditional architecture. You also may have noted the materials. Above the cornice, we've got stucco, which is a traditional exterior building material that is often applied to masonry walls. Below the cornice, you may have noted stone revetment, thin slabs of stone. Again, a traditional sort of finish material that is applied onto masonry buildings. As far as what's modern about this, you may have noted the square sheet of glass in the window opening, a piece of glass that is larger than what could have been produced using hand technology. You may have noted the fact that that opening is not on the central axis through the arched opening up above. You may have noted that the square of the window and the square of the stone, the rusticated stone panel next to it, also do not fit symmetrically under the semicircular frame or the square frame above the cornice. And you also may have noted that that one of those pieces of stone to the left of the rusticated stone panel is actually a hidden doorway, and that there is a square detail that is above that hidden doorway, but also protruding down a little bit into the doorway. And so if we take a look at this, we see this interesting combination of tradition and modernity. Mostly modern composition, but some traditional materials, some traditional details on the building. This is a work that Carlo Scarpa did in the 1950s, the Olivetti Showroom in Venice. And it gives us a little bit of insight into what we're going to see with Carlo Scarpa. Here in this particular example, we see something similar, right? Traditional materials, in this case, travertine used as a stone revetment on what appears to be a masonry wall, but used in a very unusual way. The panel of travertine is actually a door that can swing open. And so the technology for that door is something that is not traditional. And if you take a look at the composition of the opening for the door and that rectangular void, which is at the top part of the door. A lot about this is not traditional. So we see this really interesting interaction between tradition and modernity in the work of Carlos Scarpa, and that's going to give us a little bit of insight into today's lecture. Carlos Scarpa was almost an exact contemporary of both Luis Barragan and Louis Kahn. All three men were born in the first decade of the 20th century, and they all lived to be in their 70s or 80s. Like Barragan, Scarpa is perhaps not the most prolific architect of the 20th century. Certainly, Frank Lloyd Wright and Mies and many others had more buildings than he did. But like Barragan, I think it's important for architecture students to study him because of the beauty that he was able to achieve with his use of materials and his details. And the evocative quality of his designs, while certainly not aiming as high as Barragan's emotional architecture, is still something that is worth noting and investigating because it shows us what is possible with modern design. Scarpa was born in Venice and he was raised in Vicenza. Now, Vicenza, if you took history too, might be a name that is recognized. Vicenza was the adopted city of Andrea Palladio, and there are a lot of the great examples of Palladian architecture that are either in the city of Vicenza or just outside the city of Vicenza. And so Scarpa grew up with this context full of exemplary, beautiful architecture. And he decided to study at the Venetian Academy of Fine Arts. Although he didn't start out studying architecture, he ended up graduating with a concentration in architecture in 1926. He decided to make contacts with some of the most noteworthy modernist designers. So he was certainly aware of what was happening in the post-World War I architectural world. And even though that wasn't his background, he corresponded with some of these people. He kept up with what they were doing, and so in that way learned about modernist design. As a career, he ended up doing a number of things. He taught interior design at the architecture program in Venice, and in his early career, he also designed glassware for the production in historical glass workshops found on the islands around Venice. For a whole variety of different reasons, the manufacturing of glass at a small scale, handmade level, was a tradition that developed around Venice and that continued even into the modern era. And Scarpa participated in that by designing glasswork that was no longer traditional. Still the traditional materials, still the traditional method of making, but the design of what Scarpa was doing was something that was new and unseen before. And so this was one of his contributions. But he also ends up designing architecture. He never took the exams to become a registered architect, and so his professional life was somewhat limited. But working with registered architects, he was able to take on projects that ended up being incredibly beautiful, and many of those projects were for what we would call adaptive reuse in historical buildings. And these projects gave him the opportunity to develop a personal style that was informed by history and craftsmanship while still somehow being modern design. His architecture was very heavily influenced by the historical context of Venice. As many of you know, Venice is a series of islands that are located in a lagoon on the northern edge of the Adriatic, which is the sea that runs to the east of the Italian peninsula. And so if you take a look at that little inset map of the Italian peninsula, you can find roughly where Venice is located within that square, way up at the end of the Adriatic and in northeastern Italy. And then in the larger map, you can see that the lagoon itself is defined by these barrier islands that separate the lagoon from the open Adriatic. And within that lagoon, there are these islands. And Venice proper occupies a few of these islands. But there are other islands out there that are smaller, but that were also villages within Venetian domain. And it's largely on those little islands around Venice where we can still see glass production. Back at the end of the Roman Empire, these islands were all just mud flats in the lagoon. And there were probably a couple fishing villages on some of these mud flats. But at the end of the Roman Empire, we begin to see migrations and warfare as Germanic tribes began expanding out of what is today, well, what we consider northeastern Europe, and sort of coming across the fortified boundaries of the Roman Empire, and eventually coming so far south that they crossed the Alps and kind of had easy pickings of a lot of the cities in Italy, because those cities had been protected for so long by the expanse of the Roman Empire that the defenses might not have been as strong as they could have been. And so these tribes ended up sort of sweeping over the Alps and sweeping down the Italian peninsula and really not having a particularly difficult time of conquering the territory. Some of the Roman citizens who lived in northeastern Italy sought refuge, and they ended up traveling over to those mudflats in the middle of the lagoon, even if they're not very distant from the coast, because those Germanic tribes often didn't have very sophisticated naval technology. And so some of these Roman citizens were able to defend themselves better on the mudflats than they would on the mainland. Over time, as the centuries passed, the Roman citizens on what is today Venice ended up developing some pretty sophisticated naval capabilities and became an incredibly wealthy trading post, an incredibly wealthy trading empire in the medieval period, and also a quite substantial naval force within the Mediterranean. At the end of the medieval period, Venice was one of the wealthiest cities in the world, incredibly densely populated, and it had some of the great monuments of medieval architecture. And those monuments are going to have to contend with some very unideal ground conditions. The monuments themselves are often built of masonry, which is a very heavy material. How do you build masonry on a mudflat? Well, you do it with what are called pilings. And these pilings are basically the technology that they had available to them at the time, were basically logs with pointed ends that were pounded into the mud. Now, in wet locations, in coastal locations, we still sink pilings into the mud. Only today, the pilings are often tubular steel and they're pounded mechanically. But in the medieval period, without that technology, they were essentially extremely long trunks of trees that were pounded down by hand. Now, they came to discover that some types of trees are more resistant to water infiltration than others. And so by carefully selecting the wood that you use, you have a better chance of having long-lived foundations. But in addition, if the logs are pounded into mud that is created by salt water, the salt content of the water, as well as the fact that there is very little oxygen that actually gets to these logs, means that the logs are going to decay much slower than they would if they were actually exposed to oxygen. So they discovered the technology of pounding these pilings into the mud by hand and then building masonry structure up above those pilings. Now, because of the effort involved in felling these trees, transporting the trees, pounding them by hand into the mud, The foundations themselves obviously are going to demand a great deal of resources, time and money. And so basically, what the Venetians did was to design buildings that, generally speaking, are going to be point load structures if they're extremely large. And then they're going to connect the piers with relatively thin walls. Now, for smaller structure, it was completely different, right? Smaller structures, you would have load-bearing walls, but smaller structures wouldn't need the enormous areas of pilings. If you're having a large vaulted structure like some of the churches or some of the enormous palaces in Venice, then it just makes more sense to concentrate the location of the foundations and therefore the location of the pilings into a point load system. But with this technology, they were able to build some masonry buildings, most of which are built of brick, right? But brick was not considered a noble enough material to actually be exposed on the more important buildings. They would always want to cover the brick. If it was a modest building, like a mixed-use residential building with retail on the ground floor, often it would be stucco, right? Pretty quick, cheap, and easy. But for the more important buildings, the palaces and the churches, they would often use a variety of materials, most importantly stone revetment. And when we take a look at the most important buildings, we can see how they're carefully choosing the stone for the variety of textures, for the variety of colors, and then composing these facades with these really beautiful patterns that come from the materials themselves. They also had mosaic tiles that they would use for some of the more important buildings, such as here we're taking a look at a bunch of details of San Marco in Venice, which was the basilica that housed the human remains of Saint Mark the Apostle. And you can see some of the detail that's picked out in gold mosaic, and some of the narrative scenes that are seen in the lunettes on the main facade of the church. But they would use a variety of materials and develop these textures and sculpted features and bas reliefs that were often scavenged from other buildings, but reused in the facades of the more important buildings in order to create these really beautiful textures on the two-dimensional surface. And this was all part of the context that Scarpa is going to drink in, understand, and begin to reinterpret in a whole variety of ways. The first building that we're going to take a look at is an adaptive reuse of a late medieval, early Renaissance palace in Venice for a noble family. The Querini Stampaglia family was, again, a noble family in Venice, and in the middle of the 19th century, the last living heir of the Querini Stampaglia family, not having had any children of his own, decided that he wanted to turn over his fortune and the family palace, as well as the family art collection, to a foundation that would be established upon his death. And so in his will, all of that was going to go over to a new foundation, the Querini Stampaglia Foundation, that was there to display Venetian art as well as be a research center for scholars who are interested in studying Venetian art. And as a result, the family palace was adapted to serve both as a museum as well as a residence and library and study center for Venetian art. Most of the scholarly activities happened on the upper floor of the palace, and the main reception floor of the palace, which is the second floor, as well as the third floor in this case, where the main reception rooms are found, was turned over to the museum. Now, when we take a look at these different images of the old palazzo, we see things that are very typical for Venetian palace architecture. If we take a look at the plan and we see the orange L-shaped palace, we can see that it fronts a canal. It fronts one of the minor canals that crisscrosses one of the main islands of Venice. And so what we're taking a look at here in the two images are just a part of the front facade of the building. But this part happens to have the main ceremonial entrance, which is right on the canal. You can see those paired arched openings, again, right on the canal. It has the primary windows that provide light into the main reception space in the palace, which is directly above that ceremonial entryway. And then we get increasingly private spaces within the palace on the third and fourth floor of the whole complex. Scarpa was going to renovate some of the spaces that were going to serve the scholarly portions of this building. But a lot of those spaces for the scholarly activities or for the museum itself were just going to be preserved and used differently. And so if we take a look at some of the reception spaces within the palace, they now serve the museum. And it was sort of a seamless transition from one to the other. Because in a way, the rooms themselves are a museum. And to put a collection in there could easily mean just using the space without really transforming the definition of the space or the decoration of the space. But on the ground floor of the Palazzo, we're going to see Scarpa transform some spaces in order to serve as entryways, ticket areas, cafe, exhibition space. And he's also going to work on the garden, which was behind the palace, and turn that into a couple of different spaces that are going to serve the foundation. If we take a look at this partial plan of the palace, we're going to see the part that corresponds to the main facade. 3 in plan was the main entryway, and you might be able to make out the 2 openings down at the bottom of area 3 there that open onto the canal. Area 5 on the ground floor is an exhibition space that corresponds to one of the main ceremonial spaces up on the second floor of the building. And you can also see the garden out back, which is 14, 12, and 10 in that view. Those are things that we're going to be taking a look at as part of our look at the Correni Stampaglio Foundation. One of the first things that Scarpa did was to build a bridge, and the bridge in plan is number 1. Build a bridge that is going to connect one part of Venice with the palace itself. It spans the canal. The opening that he's going to transform into a doorway is actually a window, and he just cut down the bottom of the window and then designed this bridge using a variety of materials. And if we really take a look at that detailed view, we begin to see how those materials are put together. And we see this very careful attention to detail. How do you actually craft the construction of these variety of materials? This was never really conceived of as the primary entrance into the foundation, but it is sort of one of the first things you see if you take a look at the facade. Scarpa is going to preserve the possibility of entering into 3 on plan or into the main ceremonial entrance by keeping the arched openings to the canal operable. Now, few, if any, people are actually going to enter that way anymore, but he wanted to keep it as an operable entryway. And he makes a very interesting decision, especially when we view what he did in light of current problems that Venice is facing. Venice itself, these mud flats surrounded by seawater, is facing a couple different problems. First of all, at a global level, Venice sits on the northern part of the African tectonic plate. And the whole plate is pushing towards Europe, but is going below the European plate. And by going below the European plate, it's pushing up the Alps. It's obviously a very slow progression, but it's pushing north and it's going under. And because of Venice's location on those plates, Venice itself, at a tectonic level, is sinking a little bit. Furthermore, the mud upon which all of these buildings has been built is getting compressed. Yeah, you can put down pilings and you can be very careful about your foundations, but at the end of the day, we're looking at a lot of masonry construction on mud. And over time, it's going to compress it increasingly. Furthermore, because of changes to the climate and, gotta say it, global warming, the sea level is rising. And it seems to be particularly acute at the northern edge of the Adriatic, probably because of some of those tectonic shifts. But what they're beginning to see more and more, especially at the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century, is that there are times of year in which the high tide that Venice experiences is extremely high tide. It usually corresponds to the winter months, so November, December, right through March. And there are times when they understand that the high tide is going to be enormously high. And they've figured out ways of addressing that. When they realize that there's going to be high tide, there are foghorns that sound all over the city. And the people realize that this is signaling that water's coming in. And so many of the homeowners will go and seal the bottom of their doors in a variety of ways. You'll see a lot of insulated metal panels that can kind of be fit down into sea channels that are across the threshold and up the bottom of the door jambs. And they can kind of tighten them with screws or turn bolts to kind of get an airtight seal there. And yeah, it's only going to be maybe the bottom 12, 18 inches of the doorway, but sometimes that's all you need. Other people are employed by the city to go to storage areas and pull out these metal supports and lay wooden planks over the metal supports so that people can get around some of the particularly low-lying parts of the city on these elevated wooden walkways. And the Venetians have developed a sense of humor about it because it's the way things are, it's the reality, and they have a sort of fatalistic view of it. But obviously this is a problem that all of Venice is suffering. And when we think about if we look at what Scarpa did for the entryway to the Querini Stampaglia Palace, he made a very interesting decision. Rather than hermetically sealing those two arched openings, what he did was to put these really beautifully designed grates in the doorways. The grates are operable. Once again, people could, hypothetically arrive by canal. But they also allow the water in. And that was a very bold decision on his part. He was still working in an age when we thought that technology could solve many more problems than we think it can today. And had he proposed sealing them with even operable doors that were sealed tightly, people certainly would have listened to it, but he decided not to do that. So he designs these grates, the seawater can come in, and he addresses that by raising the floor level on the ground floor of the palace, but also providing this really interesting series of steps that would take you from the platform that's a little above canal level and bring you up to the elevated floor level of the interior. If we take a look at that, we're going to see that he provided, in addition to an elevated floor level, he also divided this curb that runs around the ground floor of the first couple of rooms around this, and that is additional protection from the high level of high tides. But if you take a look, you can see that in some locations, the curb is pulled free of the structure, pulled free of the diaphragm wall at the end of both of these views that is dividing one space from the next within the width of the palace. And in that way, he's allowing the seawater, when it rises to a certain level, to circulate in a very controlled way around the ground floor of the excuse me, of the palace. Excuse me. Allowing the groundwater to travel in a controlled way around the palace. Very interesting, bold decision on his part. If we take a look at the things that he did specifically with those steps, we're going to see other interesting points. First of all, a combination of material, modern and traditional. Modern materials would be the concrete. We know that that's an ancient Roman material that had been reused, but in the 19th and 20th centuries, it had been so long out of use that in many ways it was considered modern. But the top of each of these steps and platforms is a local stone that was quarried and that was used extensively in Venice. If we take a look at the composition of those stairs, we're going to see something that is not the traditional organization along a central axis of steps. Rather, it's this modern composition of geometric shapes. So a whole series of very bold decisions that he's making here for the entryway. And beyond the entryway, if we move from 3 in plan to 5 in plan, we're going to see an enclosed gallery space that he created on the ground floor of the building that spans the depth of the building from the entryway to the garden behind. And like most spaces, most interior spaces in Venice, especially spaces on the ground floor, there's a lot of humidity and coldness that needs to be counteracted somehow in this building. And especially for gallery space, you want to be able to protect the things that are on display there from humidity. And the heating technology of the time in Italy was predominantly radiator heat, so hot water that travels through pipes to radiators where the hot water can expand through these different grills and sort of emit the heat through the metal enclosure, which works well if you're going to have to keep interior spaces heated continuously over a number of weeks or months. And also, it has a drying effect. It really sort of reduces the moisture just because of the way the heat's pumped into the space. And so there are some radiators here. Taking a look at the end wall of this space, you might be able to see the elevated radiator over on the left. But if we take a look at the plan, and if we take a look at the wall enclosure that separates 5 from 3, you're going to see that there's a little alcove that Scarpa created. And that alcove houses a large radiator, but it's also created in a very interesting way. It protrudes out into the entryway. It is enclosed in sheet glass, but rather than the clear or very slightly tinted sheet glass that you see at the other parts of the opening to the gallery, it's smoked sheet glass, so almost completely opaque. And then he lined the exterior of that sheet glass with stone revetment. And again, we're seeing this interesting combination of modern and traditional. What's traditional? Well, revetment used as a finished material. And then the sort of stone that was used here, again, a stone traditionally quarried and used for surfaces in Venice. What's modern about this? Well, the revetment is attached not to a masonry wall, as it would have traditionally been, but rather it's affixed onto sheet glass. And if you take a look at the geometry of the individual pieces of the stone, and if you look at the way that they're connected, we see modern composition. Scarpa is going to say something about the way that these pieces of stone were formed by sorts of jigsaws. In the image to the left, if you take a look at those pieces of revetment, if you take a look at where vertical lines intersect with horizontal lines, you see that there's a square that's cut out there. so that the cut of the saw doesn't actually intersect with the orthogonal cut and therefore have the possibility of a defect where one saw is going to sort of overshoot the mark a little bit, but rather he had these precision cut squares, and then the vertical and horizontal lines come into the square so that you don't see a messy intersection of the cut itself. If you take a look at, again, the geometry of the pieces, you see the way that the pieces sort of overlap around the corner. Not traditional, although he's accentuating the joints traditionally. The joints have been made obvious by a little indentation that follows the cut, and then it's gilded using this luxurious material, gold, to really pick out some of the detail here. So an interesting combination of modern and tradition in a variety of things here in the Quirini Stampaglia Foundation. And what we see overall is also Scarpa really embracing the context in Venice. Rather than trying to wall the palace off, rather than trying to allow the palace to be under in a glass container, something preserved and untouchable and put on display. He wants it to be lived, and he wants it to interact with the context in Venice. And so he allows Venetian problems to continue to be problems for the Quirini Stampaglia Foundation, perhaps most notably in the entryway there. Now, if we take a look at the garden, we're going to see something that is very interesting, and that also tells us about another tradition that Scarpa was particularly fond of. And I'll get to the quote right away. This is what Scarpa had to say about the garden at the Quirini Stampaglia Foundation. If you take a look, this view down into the garden shows a relatively small green space, completely enclosed by tall perimeter walls that separate the noble family's garden space from all of the other buildings. And between the perimeter wall and the other buildings are these little narrow alleyways that give access to other residences and allow you to sort of get lost in some of the islands of Venice. As you might imagine, in a city that is this densely populated, green space was a complete luxury. And the fact that this family had green space available to them speaks volumes about their wealth and their power. But Scarpa is going to find ways in which he can develop the garden to serve the foundation and the museum that the foundation contains. This is what he had to say about his design for the garden. One must think of the great skill with which the Japanese use a very small space and create magical things. I have really and truly seen things in Japan, in very small spaces, that for sheer ingenuity beggar description. Where I lived in Kyoto, in a little house, you could open the little door and see 3 drops falling. Drip, drip, drip. To be absorbed in a patch of land 3 or 4 meters long, and there were 3 or 4 plants that needed this moisture, and that were even in bloom. At the Quirini Stampaglia, there is a modest attempt at this sort of thing. This garden, if you have seen it, is basically a tiny one, delicate, refined, distinctive, authentic, and very, very well groomed. So we see that Scarpa was fascinated by things Japanese, and we see that he's drawing inspiration from his own personal experience of Japanese gardens in designing this. So let's take a look at the tradition of Japanese landscape design, pull it apart a little bit, understand some of the essential elements, and then look at the ways in which Scarpa used those elements or principles in his design here for Quirini Stampaglia. Here we're taking a look at a view of different views of a garden at an imperial villa in Kyoto. And this was something that Scarpa had seen and studied himself, and so this is going to give us some insight into what he's looking at. The other images are not of this imperial villa, but this shows things that Scarpa was so impressed with. Gardens that are at first glance naturalistic, but when you really take a look at it, highly stylized. Great attention to detail, great attention to sensory experience and the variety of experiences that are created as you move through the space. The tradition of landscape design in Japan has been for centuries largely handed down orally from master to pupil. However, there are two texts, one from the 11th century and one from the 15th century, that record some of the basic lessons of master landscapers. Now let's think for a second about those dates. One from the 11th century and one from the 15th century. In the 15th century in Western Europe, we begin to see Alberti writing about architectural theory, and then a whole series of treatises in the Renaissance and Baroque periods following that. In the 15th century, we don't have a treatise of landscape design in Western Europe. That doesn't happen for another 2 centuries. But we do see one in Japan, and as a matter of fact, we see an earlier one that dates from the 11th century, or from the thousands, the 1000s. This is incredibly early, and it's really wonderful that we have these sources available to us because they're going to provide insight into this long-standing tradition. Like the architecture in Japan, so the landscape design is this interesting interaction between foreign influence coming from the Chinese mainland, as well as native principles and native developments, always interacting with these waves of influence. And like in architecture, there's a very strong imprint from the different religious or philosophical systems in Japan, Shinto and Buddhism. The treatises, both of them, spoke about the basic materials that are needed for Japanese landscapes. And those materials are plants, rocks, and water. And a substitute for water could be raked sand or raked gravel, which is often sort of understood to sort of stand in for a water feature. So both of them spoke about this basic set of materials. They also talk about the process of selecting the materials and composing with the materials. And here we get into something that's a little bit maybe esoteric, but it's kind of like a feng shui for the use of these materials. For example, they believe that rocks and stones have an energy to them. And it's important in using the stones to understand their initial position. How were they lying when you went and collected them, or dug them out of the ground, or quarried them? Because you would need to keep the orientation of the stone. You wouldn't want to turn it on its end. You wouldn't want to turn it upside down. You had to keep the original orientation, because otherwise you're going to have all sorts of messed up energy in the space. Right? Furthermore, for pavers, for example, they believe that the stones have a geometry and therefore a directionality to them that you would want to understand and harness so that you could use it to begin shaping the experience of people who come to the garden. Rarely, if ever, do you see the full expansion of the space of a Japanese garden. Often the gardens are in very tight spaces, very tiny spaces, but even in larger areas, you don't often see a large axis through the garden like you might see in a French Baroque garden. You don't see much of planting along the perimeter, even in a small space. Now we might think, well, if you've got a small space, you want to keep as much of it open as possible. So put all the plants around the perimeter and maintain as much open space in the middle as possible. But the Japanese understood that if you do that, you're going to see exactly what the area is, and you'll know exactly how small it is. It's better to suggest greater depth than is actually there. Allude to spaces that unfold as you move along the path. And so set up screens. Screens can be of trellises. Screens can be of stones. Screens can be of plants themselves. And allow the visitor to begin exploring the areas hidden by the screen and begin to imagine that there's much more space than is actually there. They paid attention to sensory experience. What does it feel like when you're walking on a flat paved surface and all of a sudden your foot falls into large, um, some large stones? What does it feel like then when your next foot falls on a surface of pounded sand? What does it feel like when the footstep following falls upon a paver? Right? What's the sensory experience of walking around the garden? Can you set up features that are going to appeal to the sense of hearing? Can you have the drip of water organized in such a way that it's going to be audible and that it's going to provide a destination for you as you meander around the garden? Often they're going to recreate natural settings. In some cases, settings that are based on real features, in some cases, sort of abstract or idealized settings. Near the city of Kyoto, on the coast, there is a lagoon that is formed by this sandbar, which you can see in the upper image here, that has all these pine trees on it. It was a famous natural setting, and in an imperial villa in Kyoto, there was the conscious attempt to recreate that, however symbolically, but having ways to allude to that sandbar in the design of the lakes on the imperial villa. And in other cases, it can be sort of an idealized view, such as we see here of an idealized view of a rocky shoreline. Right? Doesn't refer to a specific view, but sort of in general. All of these things are ideas that Scarpa could potentially have understood. Certainly, examples like this are ones that he was impressed with and that he studied. And we're going to see that each of the points that I made about sensory experience and imitating natural, actual settings, all of these things are going to be found in his design for the garden at the Querini Stampaglia Foundation. If we take a look at the garden, you can see that it actually consists of two different parts, number 14 and number 10. Number 14 is a small sliver of the garden that has been set aside to serve the cafe that was put into the ground floor of the Querini Stampaglia Foundation. And so if you're in there today, you can go to the cafe, and if the weather's nice, you can exit through some of the doorways around the perimeter of 14, actually take your cup of coffee or whatever, your sandwich, out to the terrace and enjoy your sandwich outside. But if you take a look, you can see that there are these two poche lines, discontinuous poche lines, that are separating 14 from 10. And if you look at the aerial view, you can see how those discontinuous lines correspond to concrete walls. But they're discontinuous, right? They don't completely, irrevocably cut off one from the other, but rather there are views through, and there's a little water feature that prohibits you from actually jumping from one to the other through that opening. But you can see there's sort of a screened off view of one part from the other of the garden. So prohibiting a full understanding of the limited expanse of the garden, screening view, something that we certainly see in Japanese landscape design. We also see attention to sensory experience. In the part of the garden labeled 10, between the exit from the ground floor exhibition space, and that exit area is labeled 9 here in plan, between 9 and 10 there is a slight difference in ground elevation. And so there needed to be a retaining wall. And the retaining wall, which we can see is this thick but relatively low concrete wall, is something that Scarpa is going to develop with a water feature. The water feature, which is labeled number 11 in the plan, is all the way to one end of that retaining wall. And there's this canal-like space that sort of is inset into the retaining wall. The beginning of the water feature, again at 11, is a water source that has about the volume of a drinking fountain. and it falls into the this maze carved out of a block of marble, and it works its way through and eventually falls a little bit, not a couple inches, but falls a little bit down into the canal, the little canal itself. And so there's a little bit of a audible experience there. But if you're in the space, you're going to hear an audible experience coming from down at the other end of the space. And so if you walk down the space, and if you sort of walk down that canal towards number 13, you're going to begin hearing louder and louder the audible experience, this sound of water. Scarpa had the little canal exit into a little pool, which then fed under part of the museum collection. And what we see here is a wellhead, a marble wellhead, which was taken from one of the little piazzas in Venice, and that was an actual public water source for people in Venice, fresh water. They had a cistern system of collecting the rainwater and having these cisterns. And often the piazzas had these public wellheads. Well, this particular wellhead was bought, I guess, by the Querini Stampaglia family and brought here and put on display. But it's also incorporated into the sensory experience of the whole garden. If you follow that canal down to the far end, you'll see that the water exits a little bit down this scupper into this little retaining receptacle, right? And the fall of water a few inches certainly makes a splash, makes a little bit of a noise. But you also hear the echo of water falling quite a distance. And this little retaining pond, let's call it, exits under the wellhead. And under the wellhead, the water drops down a number of feet into a cistern. And at the bottom of the cistern, where there's standing water, we hear that trickle of water hit the surface of water down below. And the sound of the water reverberates, echoes up the sides of the well and up the wellhead. And so if you're curious, you'll walk up to it. But if you're really curious, you'll stand on the platform where the wellhead is located, and you'll put your head over the top of the wellhead, and you'll hear the reverberation in a very different way. And so all these very subtle, audible experiences that he's incorporating into his design of the garden. And furthermore, that canal itself and the connection of the canal with green space also, I believe, is not just a coincidence. If we take a look at the area of northeastern Italy that corresponds to what became known as the Venetian mainland, we're going to see a lot of canals and a lot of cultivated areas. This part of the Italian peninsula was conquered by Venice as Venice became more powerful and more wealthy. Little by little, they began to demand greater access to foodstuffs and to some of the raw materials that come from the mainland. And so they began to conquer some of the cities nearby. They began to conquer Padua and Vicenza and Verona, eventually getting almost to Milan itself, conquering the territory, holding the territory, and so it became the Venetian mainland. And in order to really maximize their agricultural production in this area where we've got a lot of runoff from the Alps, they ended up creating canals to drain the swamps, create arable land, and also to serve as navigation. And so when we take a look at the Querini Stampaglia garden, and when we understand it in terms of the tradition of Japanese landscape design, which Scarpa suggested we should, based on his quote, we're going to see one principle of traditional Japanese landscape design that I believe Scarpa was using here. The idea that you're going to recreate in miniature, however idealized, an example of the nearby landscape. And so the connection of cultivated land and canal, I think, inspired what it was that Scarpa did here. But we're going to ask the question of Scarpa that we ask of all architects. in this part of the course. How did Scarpa develop upon international modernism? Well, we're going to see that he developed a personal aesthetic for international, or a personal aesthetic for modern architecture. Something that is very different from the radical stuff that we saw in the immediate post-World War I period, but still modern and still allowing his thumbprint to be seen on modern design. How does he create this personal aesthetic? Well, sometimes through the choice of materials, sometimes traditional materials, sometimes modern materials. Secondly, we're going to see details. And his details are often from the craft of assembly. How do you actually put these materials together? And how can my details be sympathetic to the material, to the machines that are going to be used to create the smaller pieces of material that are then assembled? And how can all of this just make sense in terms of the making of the material? Scarpa is also going to develop over time a signature detail that we see in the image to the left, which is these reiterated parallel lines. And those parallel lines often occur at joints where one material comes into contact with the next, or when one plane of the building transitions into another plane, like a corner. Now, we might think that all of these reiterated lines might sort of disintegrate the corner, right? They might sort of round off the corner. They might make the single line of the edge less obvious. But in reality, the opposite is true, because each one of these is going to pick up shade and shadow in a variety of ways. And each of these is going to reiterate the line. And so it's a sort of repeated line that ends up really accentuating the joint in the material. The way he's going to layer the materials, the way that things are going to be inset one into the other, also things that he's going to consider. And then finally, and this is going to be a little vague right now, but he's going to design forms that are appropriate for the purpose. And in the Querini Stampaglia Foundation, we see that in the design of the entryway and in the garden with that bit of landscape architecture. Right? Appropriate for the purpose, because the purpose of this building is now to allow people to understand and study Venice and its art and its architecture. And rather than allow this building to be preserved under glass, he wants it to fully participate in the context for all of its problems. And so here we can see, in a way, designing forms that are appropriate for the purpose. Now, the next thing that we're going to take a look at here is going to require us to sort of set the context. Okay, the Brion Mausoleum. Let's think for a minute about burial practices in the United States. Up until the last few decades, people in the United States were often buried in cemeteries that were considered to be parks. They were designed as beautiful, romantic landscapes, and we'd have these subterranean burials in grassy areas with beautiful trees and monuments that kind of are around in the landscape. In Latin countries and Mediterranean countries, they think of burial very differently. And here we're taking a look at some cemeteries in Italy where we can see outdoor mausolea where the coffins are inserted into this grid of structure, and then the area is enclosed with a stone that has some sort of inscription, the names, the dates, sometimes photographs. We can see underground burials where there's a little bit of a cenotaph, which is covering actually an underground vault where we can have a number of coffins. Or we can see family mausolea, like over on the right, little individual buildings where a number of family members would be buried. Obviously, these are very dense. Obviously, they're used by multiple generations, and space becomes a problem, as it does around the Mediterranean. So what do? Well, people's remains were allowed to decompose for a set period of time, and then At the end of that period, people would come in and open the coffins, take what remains were still left, which at that point was basically a skeleton, rearrange the bones into a smaller container, put the smaller container in the family vault, but open up space for another generation, throwing out the old coffin, right? That was standard practice. However, bodies were buried around the Mediterranean. But sometimes they would do something different with the bodily remains. If you go to Rome today and look for the church of Santa Maria Annunziata, you're going to see a 16th century church which was built on the Via Veneto, which was one of the really most chic shopping streets in post-World War II Rome. But this was a church that was built for a particular congregation of the Franciscan family of friars, specifically the Capuchin friars, who had developed a very particular devotion that was intended to get people to think about their own death as a way of preparing for death, but also as a way of sort of organizing your life, right? Realizing that whatever it is that you're doing here, eventually you're going to be held to account for your life on earth, and also the idea that everything that we do here is ephemeral, right? It's all going to go away. So how did they do that? Well, they took some of the bodily remains of people, right, their bones, and they used them as decorative elements within the crypt of the church. In some cases, they would include mummies of some of the Franciscans themselves, but they also had access to all of these bones of the faithful that were being exhumed from burial, and they would organize them in these decorative patterns, all providing space for people to come and to be reminded very clearly that the lives of all of us are going to end and that we need to prepare for death. Here we're taking a look at another Capuchin church, this one in Milan, the Church of San Bernardino alle Osse, or San Bernardino of the Bones. And here we can see that all of the bones that were being pulled out of burials are being used sometimes as decorative elements, but also just encased within these large containers. Again, here to remind people, to give them the opportunity to meditate on the fact that life on this earth never lasts forever, and that we need to live accordingly. And so in Mediterranean lands, and especially in Italy, there was a very different approach to death and dying and cemeteries than what we're used to in North America. And that goes back to antiquity. A lot of times, ancient cemeteries would have these family mausolea, like we can see in contemporary Italian cemeteries, and oftentimes they're considered, the cemeteries are not parks, but rather they're cities of the dead. And so some of the archaeological remains, like we can see represented in plan and elevation up above, organized as little houses lining a city street. But it wasn't houses of the living, it was houses of the dead. And so a very different approach than what we're used to. And that's some background as we get into the Brion Mausoleum. The mausoleum itself was for a family on the Venetian mainland. Originally, the parents of the family came from a small, tiny town on the Venetian mainland named San Vito. But the father of the family, in the post-World War II boom in Italy, made a fortune in an electronic company. It used to be the Brion Company. Today it's known as Brion Vega, and you may be familiar with the name of the company. Just made a fortune, and the family moved away from San Vito. But late in life, the parents in the family decided that they wanted to be buried back in their hometown, and they engaged Scarpa to design what's called the Brion Mausoleum, but which is actually a large landscape garden within which there are a variety of different structures. He was given the commission, and over time, bit by bit, largely with Scarpa's, largely upon Scarpa's prompting, the family would get a little more land for their funerary garden, and Scarpa would then expand the project. And so it was this long, drawn-out process of imagining what is possible and designing and adding on and building. Um, the cemetery itself, the Brion Mausoleum, wraps like an L around one corner of the city cemetery. Um, it's located just a little outside the town of San Vito. And if we take a look at the plan up above, you can see the way that the city cemetery is laid out on a grid. And it's got all of those in-ground spaces for the placement of coffins, as well as a number of family mausolea that are around the perimeter of the space. But if you were to enter the entryway and look down one of those short axes through the space, through the cemetery itself, you'd be looking at what's known as the propylaea, or the entry gate into the Brion Funerary Garden. And if you were to go into that entry gate, if it's open, which it almost always is these days, you'd be able to go up a couple of steps and find yourself in this walkway that opens either to the right or to the left. Directly ahead of you, on top of those steps, you would see these entwined circles, which are detailed on the garden side with these contrasting color of mosaic tiles. It seems clear to me that what's represented here are the wedding bands of the parents in the family, talking about the origin of the family. But you find yourself at the top of the steps in this hallway here that is completely surrounded by hard materials. You've got poured-in-place concrete on the sides, on the ceiling, and then these pavers on the ground. If you ever go here, I would urge you to wear hard-soled shoes, because as you walk on these pavers, you're going to hear the echo of your footstep reverberate on the space. And if you were to come up those steps and hang a right, and so go down to the other end of this passageway, you're going to hear the reverberation of your footsteps change. Because at first, the pavers themselves are going to be directly on soil, and so it sounds solid. Still reverberates around the space, but sounds solid. And eventually, you're going to take a step where it sounds different. And it sounds different because the paver is no longer on solid ground, but it rather is supported underneath and supported over water. And so you hear your footstep hit stone that has a hollow ring to it, because directly under it is water. Eventually, you're going to come to this sheet of glass that's right in front of you. And that's a doorway that you need to get through in order to continue on the path. Now, I have never been there when the doorway is actually closed, because it's got a very delicate mechanism. And I think when they open this up to people, they make sure that it's open so that the mechanism doesn't get screwed up. But the doorway doesn't operate on a hinge. Rather, it operates on a counterbalance, which means that someplace there is a weight that weighs almost as much as the door, a little bit more than the door. And so the door is held in a closed position by the added weight of the counterbalance. But the way that you open the door, again, is not to open it as if it had a hinge, but rather to push it down. You push it down into the water that you're aware of because the sound of your footsteps has changed. You push it down, you step over the door, and then the mechanism of the counterweight ever so slowly raises the door out of the water. And because it's glass, you see the water sort of sheet off the glass. And as you watch the glass rise and the water sheet off of it, you're made aware of the fact that you have just made a transition, that you have left one area and are now entering into another area. A very poetic, a very interesting set of experiences. Again, not something that I personally have experienced because of the delicate mechanism here, but a very interesting transition. You would then continue on the walkway and find yourself coming out of that enclosed hallway, and the walkway extends over a lily pond and turns a corner, and leads you to what is obviously your destination, which is this little pavilion that is over a little island in the lily pond. Now, for most of us, if we were to go under the overhang of the pavilion, we'd have to duck. Even though there's that little indentation there, most of us would have to duck a little bit. And so if we were standing up on the area under that pavilion covering, what we would see would be the side of those metal panels, or if you were tall enough, you'd see the side of the poured in place concrete up above. You wouldn't be able to see any great panorama from this pavilion while you were standing. And furthermore, overhead is open, right? There's no roof over this. You would just see the blue sky or the gray sky, the clouds up above, but there's no roof. If, however, you walked over to the little planter there and sat down, you'd be able to look over the rest of the lily pond down the full length of one of those arms of the L-shaped funerary garden to the tomb of the parents, which is that low arched construction, and even beyond that, to the village church and to the foothills of the Alps beyond. And so you'd get the chance to sort of take it all in. If you decided that you wanted to go down and see the rest of the funerary garden, you'd backtrack, find your way down that walkway, over the doorway, and eventually come out and see yourself in closer proximity to two tombs. One tomb, the low arch there, is specifically for the parents, and the other tomb, which is a little to the left of it in the view in the upper left-hand corner, has a very different geometry. It's sort of this rectangular square section volume held aloft at an angle. Okay? Let's take a look for a minute at the tomb of the parents. This is what Scarpa had to say about the tomb of the parents. He wrote, "The deceased had asked to be close to the earth, so I decided to build a small arch, which I will call Arcosolium. I thought it was a good idea for two people who had loved each other to be put in such a way as to be able to greet one another after death. The Arcosolium became an arch, a bridge span, an arch of reinforced concrete, and would still have looked like a bridge if I hadn't had it decorated. But instead of painting, we used mosaics, a Venetian tradition that I interpreted in a different way." A couple of interesting points about this. The deceased asked to be close to the earth. He wanted them to greet one another after death. Arcosolium. Arcosolium is an archaeological vocabulary word for a burial technique that we can see in catacombs. The most important historical catacombs or underground burial areas are in and a little to the south of the city of Rome, and they're cut into the soft lava rock, the tufa, that is found in the Roman area. These catacombs underground, obviously they need to be dug out, excavated. Often they would go down to a certain depth and then spreading horizontally with these different walkways. And as they went, they would carve out spaces in the side walls that would be niches, if you want to call it that, or shelves, where you could put the bodies of the deceased and then enclose the bodies with mortar and brick, or sometimes mortar and a stone slab, and contain the bodies there in a sealed environment. As you needed more space, you could just drop the floor of this walkway lower and lower, or you could tunnel down even further and have a second story below grade, a third story below grade with these walkways and all of these tombs. This was the most common sort of tomb that we see in these underground passages. But we also see that wealthy people had the opportunity to have family mausolea within this system of the catacombs. Often there would be larger areas carved out, sometimes beautifully decorated like we see in these two examples. And sometimes around the perimeter walls, we'd see not the shelf-like places for the bodies, but often we would see this arch that would be carved out of the living rock. And then below the arch, there would be this sarcophagus, again carved out of the rock. When someone died, their body would be placed in the sarcophagus, and then there would be a stone slab that would be put over it. This combination of stone slab and arch is where we get the compound word article solium. Solium comes from the Latin word for sill, in other words, that stone slab, and arco obviously comes from arch, and so it's the arch over the sill. And this is the vocabulary word that Scarpa is using for the tomb that he designed for the parents. And so this with tile, not with painting, but with tile, designing the sarcophagi out of a variety of materials, but leaning in one to the other so that one member of the family greets the other after death. And if we move beyond that and take a look down the other arm of the L, the first thing that we see is that rectangular volume that covers the tomb of other people, or the burial spaces of other people in the family. In the image to the upper left, we can see the covering for those burials over to the left. And then we'll take a look down at the end of that arm of the L to the chapel, which is beyond the brilliant red tree that you see here in that particular view. In both the covering for the burial spot of the other family members, as well as the article solium for the parents in the family, which you're seeing in the lower right here, we see an attention to light and bringing light in. For the members of the family who are going to be buried in the ground, in the raw dirt covered in ivy that you see in the image to the upper left, but in the lower right of that image, there's a gap in the geometric shape that's going to allow light in. In the article solium for the parents, there's going to be a gap on the underside between those mosaic tile surfaces, a gap between two of the ribs that we see on the upper side that he fills in with thin sheets of alabaster, a stone material that, if cut thin enough, is translucent, and thin sheets of alabaster are a traditional material. You can often see them used in ancient Roman architecture or in some of the early Christian basilicas in order to enclose the window openings. Rather than glass, you'd have thin sheets of alabaster. So we see, again, tradition being used here in the choice of materials for the article solium. Now, if we go to the chapel, we're going to see that there's a process of getting to the chapel as well. You got to walk off the grass, down a step, find yourself in this hallway that is going to take you to an entryway into the chapel. And the chapel itself is square in plan, but it's rotated. So it's actually a diamond. And the altar is going to be in one corner of the diamond. This was designed and built in the period after the Second Vatican Council, when a lot of the traditional requirements for the altar and the liturgical furnishings required for Catholic masses had loosened up. And so a lot of what you would traditionally find in churches could be organized differently, or sometimes you didn't need the old things that you needed. When we take a look at Scarpa's design for the liturgical area, again, in that corner of the diamond, we're going to see a couple of steps, one up into the area beyond the altar, secondly, a taller area, yet another step for the priest at the altar. You see that the altar is organized so that the priest can be behind the altar facing the people, which we can traditionally see in a few ancient Roman basilicas, but generally was not the norm throughout the Catholic world until the Second Vatican Council. We're going to see a variety of ways in which Scarpa is bringing light into the chapel. In the ceiling over the altar, we can see this skylight that is going to bathe the altar in light. Behind the altar, we're going to see these little windows with alabaster in metal frames that are all operable, but again, alabaster, that traditional material. And then down below the altar itself, we can see these two doorways that are covered in a very fine waxed plaster that are actually operable and that open out so that you can see the reflecting pool that the entire chapel is sitting in. A reflecting pool, and you can get the reflected light and maybe a little bit of the sound of lapping water as it comes into the chapel. Now, what I described here is the way that you would enter into the funerary garden if you were visiting. But if you were actually here to bury somebody, you would go about it in exactly the opposite way. The way that you would enter, if you're going to bury a member of the Briand family here, is not to enter through the city cemetery, but rather enter from the roadway down at the part of the L-shaped funerary garden that faces the roadway. There is this gate that is cast concrete on rollers that with great exertion can be opened, and that allows entryway into the funerary garden. When you enter into the funerary garden, the pallbearers are going to walk down the pathway to the right of the diamond-shaped chapel, come to an exterior space that is large enough so that they can rotate the coffin, and then bring the coffin into the chapel head first, per tradition. Everybody else is probably going to take a little deviation over a green space and then walk over these pavers that are above the reflecting pool and enter the chapel from the other entryway. And here we're taking a look at the exterior of the chapel, and again we can see some of those signature Scarpa details where the wall transitions to the roof. The chapel obviously is going to be set aside for the religious rites. It would be possible to have a full-out mass, a full-out funeral mass here. But after that, people are going to file out and follow the coffin to one of the two burial spots, depending on who they are. And then from there, they get a view down to the other end of the funerary garden, down to the pavilion. And Scarpa had some things to say about his design for the funerary garden or for the Briand Mausoleum. He said, "I wanted to show some ways in which you could approach death in a social and civic way, and further to express what meaning there was in death, in the ephemerality of life. The pavilion is for repose, to take stock of death, think, meditate. I think it is necessary to do that. In our house, we never do that, but in a certain setting, we can do it." And so we see Scarpa designing for the process of mourning, the process of the religious rites that were still used to say goodbye to people, and then the way that we mourn people individually, but also with an attention to social and civic ways after death. So when we look at Scarpa's architecture, in the two examples that we've briefly taken a look at, as well as other things, we see a real personal sort of modernism that he develops through his choice of materials, through the details that he develops, and also through forms appropriate for the purpose, whether the purpose is a foundation for the preservation and study of Venetian art, or whether the purpose is mourning and saying goodbye to dead people.